Hey Team Bio, so today's screencast is talking about human impact on biomes. And yesterday's screencast we talked about the ways that temperature and precipitation really determine the global distribution that we see of biomes. And today we're going to be talking about how changes to temperature can also affect precipitation rates and is changing the way that biomes function around the world as a result of climate change. So this is probably not new information to you, at least this first bit, but we've talked in a little bit of depth about different nutrient cycles. We've talked about nitrogen and phosphorus and carbon, and we'll also talk about H2O later on down the road. But climate change is mostly a disruption of the previous carbon cycle. And this is because humans, 500 years ago, when we looked at rates of carbon dioxide production and consumption, we found that those two things were roughly balanced. Photosynthesis is a way to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and cellular respiration returns it to the atmosphere. And if those two things are in balance, then the total amount of carbon in the atmosphere is staying unchanged. If you look here, we've got less photosynthesis than cellular respiration happening on the land, but if you look over here, there's actually a lot of photosynthesis happening in the ocean. So these two kind of factors roughly balance each other out. But humans have dramatically changed the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels. And so we can see that really clearly in if we're able to measure atmospheric concentration of CO2 and see that it's relatively stable up until the Industrial Revolution, and now it's gone way up because we're burning a lot of fossil fuels. And why is this a problem? Well, carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas along with methane and those are the two big ones, carbon dioxide and methane. So sunlight from the sun comes down, hits the earth. Some is absorbed by the earth, and then some is reflected up back into the atmosphere. And some of that energy escapes into space, and then some is trapped by greenhouse gases. And this trapping is actually a good thing to a certain degree. If we didn't have this, the earth would be really, really freaking cold. But as we've added more carbon dioxide and methane to the atmosphere, we are trapping more radiant heat. And we can really clearly see that the average temperature around the globe has gone up dramatically in even the last 50 years or so. So this is the difference in average temperature between 1951 actually, and 1981 versus 2001 to 2010. So you can see up here that different areas, so the areas that are white, I think there's no data for those areas, or limited data. Actually, maybe those are unchanging. I'm not sure if those are unchanging or no data. I can look back at that and report back in class. But, excuse me, we've seen increased temperatures in many places around the world, and especially in the polar regions, or in the North Pole. So colder areas are getting hotter faster. So because we're trapping more of the sun's energy on Earth, the Earth is warming up. And I'm sure you've all heard that before. What you might not have heard about as much is that precipitation rates are also changing very dramatically as well. So this is a change in annual precipitation in inches over the last 30 years compared to the 20th century. And you can see here that the areas of the country that are typically wet are getting wetter, and the areas of the country that are dry are getting drier. So not only is global climate change changing the temperature, but it's also changing the precipitation rates around the world. And those two factors, as you know, have the biggest influence on biome distribution. So changing these two things really dramatically changes how biomes are going to be distributed around the world and the type of organisms that can live in those biomes. We're especially seeing big changes in extreme precipitation events, so either rainfall or snowfall. So you can see in the Northeast that the extreme precipitation changes, so like big storms, have increased by more than 20%. Between 1909 and 2016. And if we look around the world, we can again see the same trend. Wet areas are getting wetter and already dry areas are getting drier. So huge changes to both temperature and precipitation as a result of climate change. Okay, so what are some implications about this changes for organisms? So one thing that organisms can do in response to climate change is move their location. So if you have to exist within a certain band of temperature, you can move north. And we see this actually in the ranges of certain insects are expanding further and further north as the globe heats up. But this, you might see, presents a problem for organisms that are already in the North or the South Poles. They have nowhere to go further north or south. This also presents a problem to sessile organisms. Sessile means not moving. So the distribution of like current trees or barnacles would be another example of a sessile organism. So you can change your location, but not everybody can change their location, and not everyone can go to a colder place, because if you're at the top of something, like at the top of a mountain, for example, or at the top of the world, either the North or the South Pole, there's nowhere else for you to go. This also has implications for relationships between organisms. For example, there is a tight mutualistic relationship between flowering plants and their pollinators. And as the spring, warm weather is coming earlier and earlier every spring, then the flowering time of certain plants is pushed earlier and earlier as well. Now, this flowering time has to sync up with the time that the pollinators are around and active. And so the migratory patterns of certain birds and insects is also changing to accommodate this earlier flowering time. So if the pollinators aren't around, it's not good for the plants because they are not distributing their pollen, and then basically they're not able to have sex. And it's a problem for the pollinators because this is where they gather most of their food energy. Another interesting kind of relationship is some changes in, how do I want to say this? Some organisms get their cues from temperature changes. So, for example, flowering would be a temp cue, but some organisms get their cues from photoperiod. This is the length of day, how long day is versus how long night is. So as the temperature changes, some organisms are changing when they flower or move because of the temperature cue, but other organisms are stuck in a photoperiod cue. So the photoperiod is not changing while the temperature is. Our days are still 24 hours long, and the length of day in March or April is still the same year to year. So this is a problem for organisms like the snowshoe hare, for example. It is keeping its white coat into what is now the spring when it should be shedding that white coat and turning brown. Okay, and what are some possible solutions to this problem? Well, evolution, as we know, leads to dramatic changes in organisms, but as you also know, that evolution can only work on existing variation. So if there's not a variation that is well suited to a warmer climate or earlier flowering time, evolution can't act on it. So some species that are probably going to be fine and be able to adapt to these changing conditions, they're going to have high genetic diversity and usually a short lifespan. Organisms that have low genetic diversity can't change very easily because there's not enough existing variation for evolution by natural selection to do its work. And also, organisms that have a long lifespan have a longer time period over which evolution can act. So the species that are going to do the best with these rapidly changing conditions around the world are going to have high genetic diversity and generally a short lifespan. Okay, that is it. You should also be thinking about the type of biome you want to do your poster project on. All of the biomes are listed in our course syllabus.